The Sony Playstation. The PlayStation wasn't the first game console capable of producing 3D graphics, but for most people it may as well have been. When it first released in 1994, the video games industry as we know it had only really existed for around 20 years or so, and for pretty much that entire time, save for a very small number of developers, everyone had been working almost entirely in 2D. There were games that managed to mimic 3D, games that made 2D sprites out of 3D models, and 3D visuals had been available on arcade machines for a few years. But now everyone could experience real-time 3D visuals at home. Sure, they were pretty basic, but that didn't stop it from being a major leap forward. The possibilities just seemed so limitless, but naturally it would take time for developers to understand, navigate, and properly utilise the new dimension on offer, both from a gameplay and a visual perspective. One of the biggest things to keep in mind with the introduction of the third dimension is that we exist in a three-dimensional world. The medium had just taken one of the biggest steps towards replicating reality that it ever could. Whilst it may seem absurd to call Battle Arena to Shinden realistic, especially when we now have this, it was still an important step. These visuals were an important leap towards getting us to where we are today in terms of visual fidelity. Artists and developers were restricted to very low image sizes for textures, low poly counts, and very limited resources in terms of lighting in real time and physics in real time. But that didn't mean they weren't going to try and do realistic graphics, it just meant that they were going to have to get a bit creative with how they achieved it. Let's take a look at some racing games to start off with, seeing as the genre has always been used to showcase graphical fidelity. The original Ridge Racer was ported from the arcades to the PlayStation as a launch title. The frame rate and visuals weren't quite as good as the arcade version, but we can still see a lot of the techniques being used here that developers would utilise for the console's entire lifespan. One of the most immediate ones is how Ridge Racer imitates shadows. Going as a third-person view, you can see shadows directly underneath every car. Aside from following the car at all times, they aren't really responding to anything in the level. There's no light simulation, it's essentially just a collision box that darkens whatever texture is underneath it. But a more interesting attempt to imitate lighting happens when you're driving through tunnels. As the car moves inside, you can see its colour fading to something that isn't just darker, but it's also absorbing the warm yellow hue of the light bulbs in the tunnel. Now, this is likely only being done with a trigger volume or something. If it were actual light, then we'd see the change pass over the car instead of affecting the whole body evenly. But it's a clever trick to get the idea across. You can also see it done on the track itself, with shadows around the edge of each tile, where the direct light doesn't quite fully reach. Again, there's no actual light simulation, which means that these details would have to have been painted directly onto the texture itself. Ridge Racer is less visually exciting outside of this tunnel though. Many of the buildings and other elements of the world just use flat billboard textures instead of full geometry. And lighting elsewhere in the world is just generally very flat, if it even exists. The skyboxes look fantastic though, and I am a slut for a good skybox, but looking at the series a few years later for Ridge Racer Type 4, and it's kind of amazing how much better it looks. Released in 1998, Ridge Racer Type 4 looks incredible for the hardware and still looks great to this day. Playing it for the first time only a few weeks ago is the main thing that inspired me to make this video. A lot of the same lighting tricks are here as in the original Ridge Racer, but they're all over the tracks now, including shadows from objects and geometry off the track itself. That geometry has also been massively increased with significantly fewer billboard textures and full 3D models for most buildings, road signs and even the one character model. But it's the new stuff that really shines. Tracks taking place at different times of day gives them all more colour variety. On the daytime tracks you can see the side of your car facing away from the sun, being coloured darker, and it makes the increased lighting variation stand out significantly more on nighttime tracks when it's much darker. And it's not just the lighting on the cars that changes, but the reflection on the windows updates with the angle of the camera too. It's not a real-time reflection, just a texture that stretches and warps in relation to the camera perspective, but it feels real. Other cool effects come from the lights on the cars themselves. You can see the lights in the distance ahead of you, and they even have light trails that emphasise their movement. In the right conditions you can even see bloom textures on lit headlights. Nothing around them is being lit up, the lighting doesn't change, but it feels like it has. I think that Ridge Racer is in contention for the best looking game on the PlayStation. I even think it looks better than Sony's first party efforts with Gran Turismo. And that's not to say that Gran Turismo looks bad at all. There are a few things it even does better, like the more dynamic reflections on the cars. But Ridge Racer just looks a lot more interesting. There's a lot more things going on at any given time than there are in Gran Turismo. Now, like I said earlier, racing games are quite often used as big, flashy visual showcases for a system, but the same can also be said for other kinds of sports games as well. I'm just going to apologise in advance for the quality of gameplay you're going to see in this section. I'm just really bad at sports games. I don't think that Cool Borders 2 looks very good. The floor looks like the snow has started to melt and it's now just a mush of dirt and slush. The colours on the mountain as a whole just feel drab and lifeless, and this is made even less impactful by the skyboxes, pretty as they are, just not doing anything to affect the colours or the lighting of the courses. However, jumping all the way to Cool Borders 4 gives us a huge improvement. Clearer snow textures on the floor make it look like you're moving down actual snow with slight shadows textured in on the most used parts of the course. In 2, the snow particles that you'd create as you progress down the mountain were just a single alpha texture that appeared behind you. In 4, now we have chunks of snow being sprayed into the air that change direction based on how you're steering. It's not just reacting to your location and speed, but with the board itself, and that board and your character now both have shadows. Not just a dark circle beneath your feet, but actual shadows that change shape with you. It's a great showcase of how developers got better at working with the limitations they had, whilst further understanding what looks good under these constraints. But Cool Borders took multiple entries and a change of developers to look this good. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater looked good from the start, in large part because of how grounded its environments feel. Just the first level in the first game is full of details. The shards of glass flying out when you crash through the window at the start, the beams of light pouring in from outside, the colours in how dirty the floor textures look, the wear and tear on the bottom of the halfpipe. There's even reflections in this puddle in the corner using the old Crash Bandicoot technique of having an identical flipped model under the floor. The reflective surface is just acting as a viewing window. Even just making some of the obstacles out of boards of plywood that have been propped up against whatever was lying around adds so much to making this space feel real. It genuinely feels like you're skating around an abandoned warehouse. The next stage, School, doesn't fare quite so well, in part because being a large outside area means that the limited draw distance is on full display. That's not to say it looks bad, the texture and material work is just as effective. but the cleaner environment means that there are simply fewer media details to notice. And everything that I've said here also applies to the second game in the series too. The team at Neversoft clearly understood what worked, and so they decided to iterate on that. But the third and fourth games definitely suffer from an increase in scope. See, Pro Skater 3 and 4 were also released on the PlayStation 2, and Neversoft made use of the extra horsepower to greatly expand the levels, which results in the PlayStation 1 versions looking simultaneously better and worse. The indoor foundry stage in 3 is so full of atmosphere. The sirens and the sounds of machinery whirring away in the background do a lot of work before you can even see the level. Which is good because you can't see most of the level. But when you can see it, the lighting here is very ambitious for a PlayStation 1 game, with warm orange glows from the hot metals illuminating parts of the space. The way these half pipes have a metallic shine painted onto the texture is another aspect that I really appreciate. It doesn't react to changes in camera or light, but it gives you enough information to understand what the material is supposed to be. Though my favourite effect is the steam rising from the crucible of molten steel. An orange hue has been applied to the texture to make it look as though it's being dynamically lit. The PlayStation was punching far above its weight here, and the frequent drops in frame rate really show that off. But the finer detail on top of all the stuff from the first two games is still really impressive. The Pro Skater series undoubtedly has some of the best looking games on the PlayStation. The world just feels so vibrant and lived in, but that's something that took developers a lot of time to learn how to do. The first Pro Skater game released a good few years into the PlayStation's lifespan, so Neversoft already had a decent understanding of how to make all this stuff work. The developers of games released a few years prior, closer to the start of the system's lifespan though, well, they still had to figure this stuff out. The original Tomb Raider mostly takes place in caves that feel far too bright. But the texture work does a generally good job at making the environments feel natural, in spite of the fact that the entire thing is set up on an obvious square grid. Greenery and plant life look fantastic, especially when it's hanging from the ceiling. It really sells you on the idea that this place is ancient. But the best thing that Tomb Raider does is its water effects. They're pixelated, sure, but the attempt to show light reflecting off of tiny waves on the water's surface is something that I really like, and it's enhanced even further when you look under the water. The shadows are constantly moving around like a constantly changing purling noise effect to convey the idea of the caustics on the water's surface. There's a lot of good work in the first game, but you can see how the team were able to grow as time went on, because Tomb Raider 3 completely blows it away. Environments are still made from the same grid-based structure, but it's pushed a lot harder here, with bigger and more varied spaces. Plants and various objects now have actual geometry instead of just being flat billboard textures. Rain particles fall on outside areas, and the ripple texture tricks your brain into believing that every drop is hitting the water. The biggest improvement, though, is undoubtedly the lighting. The original Tomb Raider's lighting was flat and overly bright. It didn't really match the feeling of exploring caves and ancient ruins. In contrast, Tomb Raider 3 has significantly more variation as you explore the jungle. Outdoor areas have a warm green hue from the light shining through the leaves. Indoor areas lit by torches cast a flickering orange glow around them. But what's most impressive is the pitch black spaces. At first, these seem poorly thought out and too dark to navigate. That is, until you light a flare. It'd be one thing if the flare just lit up the space around where you were standing when you used it, but you can walk around with the flare in hand and see the light moving with you. Tomb Raider 3 is seriously impressive, and whilst the PlayStation did get another 2 Tomb Raiders afterwards, 3 is still the most visually interesting, and it's really not even close. It just excels so well at making the whole world feel alive. The water houses school of fish, the jungle has apes that interact with you and pick up items from the ground. It's not just a space to explore and solve puzzles, it's a part of a living, breathing world that feels structured, whilst also looking like a naturally formed mess. Laura's character model even has some basic physics simulation with how her hair moves around and reacts to your movements and the environment. Small little physics details like this are amongst the best that you'll find for characters on the console, but that's in part because characters was something that developers were clearly still figuring out how to do. Looking at the bear in the first Tomb Raider, you don't need to look very closely to notice that the head, body and legs are all separate models that have been sort of anchored together instead of being one cohesive mesh. But if you look closely at Lara herself, you'll notice the same thing with her limbs. And it's not just Tomb Raider that does this. So many games across the console's lifespan would build characters out of separate meshes and just kind of stitch them together in the shape of whatever or whoever it was. It can often look very jarring, especially in fighting games where the characters are the main focus. Battle Arena Toshinden was a launch title in some markets, and its character models can look especially awkward. Especially when you see the two separate meshes flickering between which one's on top. The first 2 Tekken games have this issue as well, but it's nowhere near as noticeable, especially not in Tekken 2. The characters in Tekken look like they were made around this problem, and by the time it got to Tekken 3, the character models were generally a lot closer to how we build character models today. Quite surprisingly though, most sports games I looked at would use the Tekken 3 style of character models. Tony Hawk, WWF SmackDown and FIFA 2005 all recreated real people out of maybe 100 or so polygons and a 128 by 128 texture. Frankly, the results weren't great. From a distance, and if you squint, they might look alright as long as you're not looking at the face. But being so low res and photoshopped onto a mostly flat surface just makes the Tooth Fairy here look kind of uncomfortable. The hardware just simply doesn't have the resources needed to handle the necessary details of a real life face. Lara Croft's face looks fine because we didn't have a real life point of reference. But it's more difficult to suspend disbelief when the game's entire concept creates those comparisons to reality. Character models on the PlayStation fare a lot better when going for something a bit more stylized. Final Fantasy VII uses these blocky, almost chibi-like character models for exploring on the overworld, and more realistic proportions for cutscenes and also combat. And this is generally for the best. Nobody ever talks about the realistic character models in Final Fantasy VII, but whenever there's a Final Fantasy VII reference or merch or costume in something, it's always the blocky version of the model. It's always the little chibi one. That's the version that people remember the most. The stylized models also stand out a lot more in the overworld exploration segments of the game, for better and worse. But this is down to something more than just the difference in style. Final Fantasy VII makes heavy use of pre-rendered backgrounds for most of its environments. Now, pre-rendered backgrounds are actually a lot more commonplace than I first realised. Quite often you'll see them being used for menus and character select screens, even in several of the games that I've already talked about. But for Final Fantasy VII, a single image of an environment has collisions carefully placed around it to make it seem like the character is moving around the space being depicted. It wasn't the first game to use them, but it is one of the first to use them so heavily with mostly good results. One of the biggest advantages to pre-rendered backgrounds is that you can effectively convey so much more detail whilst maintaining a stable frame rate. More realistic lighting and material work are possible because that information doesn't need to be rendered in real time. You're also able to seamlessly transition your backgrounds into full motion video, making cutscenes feel far more impressive than anything the medium had seen prior. It's not all great. Sometimes the camera angle makes it awkward to tell what direction each button will move you, and you won't always be able to tell what you can and can't interact with. Pushing the select button will highlight these elements and your character, but it is definitely more of a band-aid solution than an actual fix. In some shots, your characters also just don't feel like they're a part of the environment. It looks like they're just standing on the image because, well, they are. And grounding them in that world has its own unique challenges. Even small effects like a shadow underneath the player or footprints being left behind on the ground become significantly more difficult to implement. Though one game that actually surprised me with its backgrounds is Resident Evil, these look really good. Making use of the same benefits I mentioned earlier, but the fixed camera angles mean you aren't just getting a wide view over the whole area. Walking up to more detailed and interesting parts of the environment will usually result in the camera changing to show you a pre-rendered background that's more zoomed in on that spot, with even more of the details. The camera angles also do a good job at showing where you can and can't go, but it does help that the space is much more restricted than in most games. And as time went on, developers got much better at using them, filling them with more detail and making them less confusing to navigate. Resident Evil is fantastic with how effectively it uses its backgrounds for gameplay and visuals, but every game I've played that uses pre-rendered backgrounds still has these issues to some degree. And these backgrounds took up a lot of space on the discs, so much so that sometimes you'd have to compress your images down to ruin the quality, or release the games on multiple discs. Sometimes you'd maybe even have to do both. There are areas in Resident Evil 2 where you can notice very obvious colour banding from how the image was compressed. I didn't really find this issue as much in Final Fantasy VII, but Final Fantasy VII was released on 3 separate discs. Pre-rendered backgrounds absolutely have their place. Games like Resident Evil 2 and Final Fantasy VII probably wouldn't have been made possible without them. But they have some very major drawbacks, and it is very much a technique that I think is exceptionally difficult to use effectively. Let's not kid ourselves though, none of the games I've looked at in this video actually look like real life, but developers and artists pushing for realism so early on is what paved the way for us to get to the level of detail that we have now, and that's worth appreciating. These games look good both despite and because of their limitations. The developers and the artists behind these games worked so hard to boil their environments and these locations and characters and everything down to the most important, minute details, and it worked so well that people love these games and how they look to this day. So much in fact that they're still making games that look like this. Games like Crow Country, Parking Garage Rally Circuit, Nightmare Kart, Signalis, and so many more, all released after 2020, and all the developers put work into those games to replicate the limitations of the PlayStation. Because those developers loved what those limitations produced, because they understand that these games still look good. They will always look good. And that will always be the case, no matter how much better real-time video game graphics get.